Welcome to Mr. Hutchings' History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back to the deep dive.
Oh.
Today we're going back to the 70s,
No.
diving into Richard Nixon's foreign policy.
All right.
You've given us a ton of articles and research.
Uh-huh.
Seems like you're ready to move past Watergate
Yeah.
and really get how this president, he's often shrouded in controversy, really left his mark on the world.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a fascinating period full of contradictions.
Yeah.
You've got Nixon, the staunch anti-communist, making these groundbreaking overtures to China.
Right.
And you have him vowing to end the Vietnam War, yet escalating conflict in Southeast Asia.
Wow.
His presidency's a masterclass in realpolitik.
Okay.
A really pragmatic approach to foreign policy that put national interests above ideology.
So let's set the scene for our listener.
Okay.
Imagine it's 1969, you're Nixon, you're stepping into the Oval Office.
Right.
Vietnam War is raging.
Yeah.
Cold War is at its peak, threat of nuclear annihilation.
Right.
What's the game plan? What are your top priorities in this global pressure cooker?
Well, he had four main goals in mind,
Okay.
each with its own challenges.
Right.
First, extricate the U.S. from the Vietnam War.
Right.
But he wanted to do it without appearing weak or undermining America's credibility on the world stage. So he called this peace with honor.
Okay. Peace with honor.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
It does.
But was it realistic? I mean, wasn't there this inherent tension between ending a war and maintaining, this image of global power?
Exactly. And that tension played out in many of his decisions.
Yeah.
His second goal was to ease Cold War tensions.
Okay.
And he saw an opportunity with the Sino-Soviet split.
Okay.
The growing rift between China and the Soviet Union.
Right.
He realized he could leverage that.
So basically, he was playing these two communist giants against each other.
Yeah, it was a bold gamble.
That's some high-stakes diplomacy.
His third objective was to rein in the nuclear arms race, which has, escalated to this terrifying level.
Right.
The world was holding its breath, wondering if these superpowers would actually unleash these weapons.
Yeah.
So Nixon initiated the strategic arms limitation talks, or SALT, with the Soviets, aiming to find some common ground on this existential threat.
Okay, so that sounds like a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
But how do you reduce the risk of nuclear war while still asserting yourself as top dog on the world stage?
That leads us to his fourth goal,
Okay.
maintaining America's global influence.
Oh, right.
So even though he wanted to wind down certain commitments,
Like Vietnam.
exactly,
Yeah.
he wasn't about to let the U.S. fade into the background.
Right.
This led to some, let's say, creative foreign policy maneuvering.
Okay, so we've got the goals.
Yeah.
Get out of Vietnam.
Yeah.
Cool down the Cold War.
Uh-huh.
Control those terrifying nukes.
Right.
And stay on top of the world.
The top dog, yeah.
How did he actually try to pull this off? Where do we even begin?
Let's start with his most audacious move.
Okay.
It was a gamble that completely reshapes the geopolitical landscape. Opening relations with China.
Okay.
In 1972, Nixon made this historic trip to Beijing, met with Chairman Mao Zedong and Premier Zhu Enlai.
Wow.
Think about that.
Yeah.
After decades of hostility and Cold War standoff,
Right.
the American presidents shaking hands with the leaders of Communist China.
That had to send shockwaves through the Kremlin. Did this actually change the global balance of power, or was it more symbolic?
It was a seismic shift.
Okay.
Before Nixon's visit, the U.S. treated China like a pariah state,
Right.
refusing to even recognize its government.
Wow.
Suddenly, they're talking, finding areas of agreement,
Okay.
presenting this united front against the Soviets.
So putting a lot of pressure on the Soviets then.
Immense pressure on the Soviet Union to engage more constructively with the U.S.
Right.
And it paved the way for China's eventual rise as a global economic and military power.
So score one for Nixon on easing Cold War tensions. But what about Vietnam? How did this realpolitik mindset play out there?
Well, like most things with Nixon, it's complicated.
Okay.
He campaigned on a promise to end the war.
Right.
And he did manage to negotiate the Paris Peace Accords in 1973,
Okay.
leading to the withdrawal of U.S. troops.
So mission accomplished.
Not so fast.
Okay.
While the Accords were a political win for Nixon,
Right.
they didn't really address the core issues tearing Vietnam apart.
Oh, okay.
The fighting continued, and just 2 years later, in 1975, Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese forces.
Right.
It was a symbolic defeat for the U.S.,
Yeah.
and it raised serious questions about whether Nixon's approach had truly achieved peace with honor.
A mixed bag on Vietnam, then?
Yeah.
What about those nuclear weapons?
Right.
Did he manage to make any progress there?
No, some historians, let's call them the optimists,
Okay.
see Cited as a big win.
Okay.
Nixon and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev signed the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty,
Okay.
limiting the development of missile defense systems.
Right.
And they agreed to freeze the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Okay.
For the first time, the superpowers were putting limits on their nuclear arsenals.
That sounds like a major step back from the brink, but I have a feeling there's another side to this story.
There always is with Nixon.
Okay.
Critics argue that SALT, I didn't go far enough.
In what way?
It essentially froze the arms race at a very high level,
Okay.
not actually reducing the number of nuclear weapons.
Right.
They say it was more about managing the Cold War than ending it,
Okay.
and that Nixon missed an opportunity to push a real disarmament.
So even a seemingly positive development like SALT High has its complexities.
Definitely.
Seems like every win for Nixon came with a catch.
It seems that way.
Makes you wonder about the true cost of this realpolitik approach.
Yeah.
Did he ever prioritize ideals over pragmatism?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And it leads us into some of the more controversial aspects of Nixon's foreign policy.
Okay.
The dark side of peace with honor. Remember how he wanted to maintain U.S. global influence?
Right.
That goal led to actions that are still debated fiercely today.
Okay.
Actions that some might argue crossed ethical lines.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
One of the most controversial decisions was the secret bombing campaign in Cambodia.
Oh, wow.
Nixon authorized these bombings to disrupt Viet Cong's supply lines,
Okay.
hoping to weaken them and gain leverage in peace talks.
Okay.
But the unintended consequences were devastating.
That sounds like playing with fire.
It was.
What happened?
The bombing destabilized Cambodia,
Okay.
pushing the country further into chaos.
Right.
This created an opening for one of the most brutal regimes of the 20th century. The Khmer Rouge.
Right.
Their reign of terror led to the Cambodian genocide,
Oh, wow.
one of the darkest chapters in human history.
That's a chilling reminder of how even actions taken with good intentions can have unintended and horrific consequences.
Absolutely.
It sounds like realpolitik could easily slide into the ends justify the means.
Exactly, and we see that again with Nixon's actions in Chile.
Right.
In 1973, his administration supported a coup d'etat
Right.
that overthrew the democratically elected socialist president, Salvador Allende.
Okay.
The U.S. had been working behind the scenes to destabilize Allende's government,
Uh-huh.
and when General Augusto Pinochet led a military coup,
Okay.
the Nixon administration was quick to offer support.
So much for spreading democracy around the world.
It was a clear example of realpolitik in action.
Yeah.
The U.S. saw Allende as a threat to its interests in Latin America,
Right.
and they were willing to support a brutal dictatorship to prevent the spread of socialism in the region.
So we're starting to see a pattern here.
Yeah.
Nixon talking about peace while expanding wars,
Right.
supporting dictators to prevent the spread of communism.
Uh-huh.
It's a complex legacy, to say the least.
It really is.
How do historians even begin to make sense of all this?
Yeah.
How do they reconcile the diplomatic triumphs with
Yeah.
these morally questionable actions?
Well, there are a few different schools of thought on Nixon's foreign policy,
Okay.
each with its own way of interpreting his actions and motivations.
Right.
But before we dive into those historiographical debates,
Okay.
let's pause and take a moment to reflect.
Yeah.
What are your initial thoughts, listener? What stands out to you about Nixon's approach to foreign policy so far?
I think we've barely scratched the surface here, and
Yeah.
I'm already rethinking everything I thought I knew about Nixon. It's clear that his foreign policy wasn't just about grand pronouncements and photo ops.
Right.
It was about making tough choices in a world on the brink.
Yeah.
Choices that had lasting consequences, both good and bad.
And that's what makes his presidency so compelling to study.
Yeah.
It's a masterclass in power, pragmatism,
Right.
and the dilemmas of leadership on the world stage.
Okay.
When we come back, we'll unpack those different historical perspectives,
Okay.
exploring how historians have wrestled with this complicated legacy. All right, let's dig into how different historians view these pivotal moments in Nixon's foreign policy.
Okay.
Take his opening to China.
Right.
Some historians,
Okay.
particularly those who, came of age during the Cold War,
Right.
see this as pure strategic brilliance.
Yeah.
They argue that Nixon, this master chess player on the global stage,
Mm-hmm.
expertly used the Sino-Soviet split to America's advantage.
So they're saying he basically outmaneuvered the Soviets by bringing China into the fold.
Exactly.
Okay.
They argue that this bold move forced the Soviets to reconsider their own position,
right,
leading to a period of détente, or easing of tensions between the superpowers.
Right.
They point to things like the Helsinki Accords, where the U.S., the Soviet Union, and dozens of other countries agreed to principles of cooperation and respect for human rights as evidence of this thaw in the Cold War.
So they're crediting Nixon with a major de-escalation of global tensions.
They are.
That's a pretty big feather in his cap. But I'm guessing not everyone sees it that way.
You're right. Other historians, particularly those who came after the Cold War and had a chance to examine newly declassified documents, take a more critical view. They argue that this opening to China wasn't just about peace and stability. It was about containing the Soviet Union. Even if it meant overlooking China's human rights abuses.
So they're saying Nixon might have been playing the long game. Using China as a pawn to weaken the Soviets, even if it meant sacrificing some moral high ground?
Precisely.
Wow.
They question whether this realpolitik approach, this focus on national interest above all else, ultimately made the world a safer place, or just shifted the balance of power. They argue that Nixon's embrace of China, while a strategic triumph, might have inadvertently laid the groundwork for future conflicts and tensions, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region.
It's amazing how two groups of historians can look at the same event and come to such different conclusions.
It is.
What about SALT I?
Right.
How do these different perspectives interpret those nuclear arms talks?
Well, those who view Nixon as a shrewd strategist point to SALT I as a crucial turning point in the nuclear arms race. They argue that it established a framework for dialogue and cooperation between the superpowers, preventing a potential nuclear catastrophe. They highlight the fact that both sides agreed to limit certain types of nuclear weapons and to establish mechanisms for verification, which was a huge step forward in building trust.
So they're saying that even though it didn't eliminate nuclear weapons entirely, it created a sense of stability and predictability in a very dangerous situation.
Exactly. They might argue that SALT I bought the world valuable time, creating a space for further negotiations and arms control agreements in the years that followed. But again, there are other historians who are more skeptical.
What would they have done differently?
They say that Nixon, despite his tough talk, was ultimately too willing to compromise with the Soviets. They believe he should have pushed harder for significant reductions in nuclear arsenals, not just limitations on their growth. They argue that the real opportunity for disarmament was missed, and that the focus on maintaining a balance of power ultimately prolonged the nuclear standoff.
So they're saying that Nixon, despite his image as a hardliner, might have missed a chance to truly reshape the nuclear landscape.
Yeah, it's a perspective.
Now, I'm guessing the Vietnam War is where these contrasting views really clash.
It is.
What do the different schools of thought say about Nixon's handling of that conflict?
Yeah, the Vietnam War is a minefield of interpretations. As you can imagine, some historians, often those sympathetic to Nixon's overall foreign policy goals, argue that his Vietnamization policy, with gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops, while training and equipping South Vietnamese forces, was the best possible option in a difficult situation.
So they're saying he was trying to find a way out of a war that had become a quagmire?
Exactly. But he didn't want to simply abandon South Vietnam. They argue that he was trying to preserve America's credibility, while also acknowledging the limits of U.S. power. They might also point to the Paris Peace Accords as a sign that he was willing to negotiate and find a political solution, even if it wasn't a perfect one. They acknowledge the tragic fall of Saigon in 1975, but argue that it was ultimately inevitable after the U.S. withdrawal.
So they see it as a pragmatic response to a complex and intractable situation? What about the critics? I'm sure they have a very different take.
They do. They argue that Nixon's actions in Vietnam were not just flawed, but morally reprehensible. They point to the expansion of the war into Cambodia and Laos, the secret bombings that destabilized the region, and the tremendous loss of life, both Vietnamese and American, as evidence of a misguided and even reckless approach.
So they see him as prolonging a war that could have and should have been ended sooner.
That's their argument. They say that his obsession with winning, with not appearing weak, led to unnecessary suffering.
Wow.
and ultimately undermined America's moral standing in the world.
Okay.
They argued that the fall of Saigon wasn't just a strategic setback, but a moral indictment of Nixon policies.
It's fascinating to hear these opposing viewpoints laid out side by side.
It is.
It really highlights the difficulty of judging historical figures and their actions.
Yeah.
Especially when those actions involve war and peace.
It's tough.
Now, we've been talking about these opposing viewpoints.
Right.
The strategists versus the critics.
Uh-huh.
But aren't there other ways of looking at Nixon's foreign policy?
Absolutely. There are historians who try to find a middle ground.
Okay.
Acknowledging both the brilliance and the flaws of his approach. They might praise his diplomatic skills in opening relations with China.
Right.
And negotiating arms control agreements with the Soviets.
Oh, okay.
While also criticizing his decisions to expand the Vietnam War and support authoritarian regimes.
Oh, okay.
They see him as a complex figure.
So they see him as a human being, with all the complexities and contradictions that come with that.
Exactly.
Okay.
They might argue that his foreign policy, for all its successes and failures, reflects the inherent tensions of being a superpower in a dangerous world.
Uh-huh.
The constant struggle to balance national interests with moral principles.
Yeah.
The need to project strength while also seeking peace.
That makes sense.
And then you have another group of historians who take a more realist perspective.
Realist in what sense?
They argue that you can't judge Nixon's actions based on some abstract notion of morality. You have to understand the Cold War context,
Right.
the threat of communism, the realpolitik calculations that drove decision-making at the time. They might say that while some of his actions might seem questionable in hindsight, they were necessary to protect American interests and prevent the spread of Soviet influence.
So they're saying we need to judge him by the standards of his time, not by our own.
Precisely.
Okay.
They might argue that the world was a very different place back then.
Right.
And that leaders had to make tough choices in a context of existential threats.
Right.
They might even say that some of his actions, however controversial, ultimately helped to prevent a wider conflict and preserve a fragile peace.
It's amazing how differently these historians view the same set of events.
It really is.
It seems like Nixon's legacy is still very much up for debate.
It absolutely is, and that's what makes studying history so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's not just about memorizing dates and names.
Right.
It's about wrestling with these complex questions, these different interpretations,
Right.
and trying to understand how the past continues to shape the present.
It's giving me a whole new appreciation for the nuances of history, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But before we get too lost in these academic debates,
Right.
let's bring it back to our listener.
Okay.
Why does any of this matter today?
Yeah.
Nixon left office nearly 50 years ago.
He did.
How does his foreign policy still resonate in the 21st century?
That's a great question.
Yeah?
And it's one we'll explore in more depth when we return.
Okay.
But I think it's safe to say that many of the challenges Nixon faced, nuclear proliferation,
Right.
great power rivalry,
Yeah.
the limits of American power,
Right.
are still very much with us today, just in different forms.
I have a feeling those parallels to the present day are going to be really eye-opening for our listener.
I think so too.
Can't wait to dive into that. Okay, so we've gone through the ups and downs of Nixon's foreign policy.
We have.
The, bold moves.
Right.
The controversial choices.
All right.
The debates that still go on.
Yeah.
But let's bring it home for our listener. Why should any of this matter to someone today in the 21st century?
Oh.
It feels like ancient history sometimes.
It might seem like a distant era, but believe me,
Yeah.
the echoes of Nixon's actions are still with us today.
Okay.
Think about his opening to China, for instance.
Okay.
That one decision set in motion a chain of events that has just profoundly changed the world.
You're saying that handshake with Mao back in 72 is still influencing things today?
Absolutely.
Oh, so...
China's economic rise.
Okay.
Its military power.
Right.
Its increasingly assertive stance on the world stage.
Uh-huh.
All of these can be traced back to that moment when Nixon decided to engage with China instead of isolating it.
Wow.
The complex relationship the U.S. has with China today,
Right.
one that's both cooperative and competitive,
Yeah.
is a direct result of Nixon's gamble.
Wow. That's incredible. One decision, all those consequences.
Yeah.
It really shows the power of diplomacy and how even small actions can have huge effects for decades.
Huge ripple effects, yeah.
What about the arms control agreements? Do those still hold any relevance today?
They do.
Okay.
Though the context has changed dramatically.
Yeah.
The Cold War is over, but the threat of nuclear war
Yeah.
hasn't gone away.
Right.
The agreements Nixon negotiated with the Soviets, like SALT, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, established precedents for arms control, helped create a framework for managing these dangerous weapons.
So even though the players have changed, the game is still the same?
In many ways, yes.
Okay.
The lessons learned during the Cold War about dialogue, verification, building trust between nuclear-armed states are still relevant as we face new challenges like North Korea or nuclear terrorism.
It's sobering to think about how these issues have persisted for so long.
It is.
It makes you realize that history isn't just something we read in books. It's a living force that shapes our world.
It really is.
Now, we talked a lot about the successes of Nixon's foreign policy.
We did.
But what about the darker side?
Right.
The bombing of Cambodia, the Chilean coup.
Yeah.
Do those actions still cast a shadow?
They absolutely do.
Okay.
Those events still fuel debates about the ethics of American foreign policy.
Right.
The limits of presidential power. The responsibility of nations to uphold human rights. Even when it's inconvenient.
So Nixon's legacy is a mixed bag, a tapestry of, accomplishments and transgressions.
Precisely.
Okay.
And that's why his presidency continues to fascinate and challenge us.
Yeah.
It forces us to grapple with uncomfortable truths about power and morality and the consequences of even the best-intentioned actions.
Yeah.
It reminds us that history is rarely black and white, and that judging the past requires nuance, empathy, and a willingness to confront tough questions.
It's certainly been a thought-provoking deep dive.
It has.
As we wrap up.
Yeah.
What's the one key takeaway? What can we learn from this part of American history?
Well, I think the biggest lesson is that foreign policy is never simple.
Okay.
It's about navigating this world of competing interests.
Right.
Making tough choices.
Yeah.
With imperfect information.
Right.
And dealing with the consequences of those choices, both intended and unintended. Nixon's presidency, with all its triumphs and tragedies, serves as this powerful reminder that leadership on the world stage requires not just strategic brilliance, but also a deep understanding of history.
Okay.
A commitment to ethical principles, and a willingness to learn from the past, both our successes and our failures.
That's a great point to end on. Thanks for guiding us through this fascinating deep dive.
My pleasure.
And to our listener, thanks for joining us on this journey into the past.
Yes, thank you.
We hope it's given you new insights into Richard Nixon, the man who reshaped the world.
He did.
And the impact of his actions. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings' History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.